In 384 BCE, in the small coastal city of Stagira, a child was born who would one day reshape the way humanity thinks about knowledge itself. At the time, nothing about the quiet streets and modest houses of Stagira suggested that this place would become forever linked to one of history's greatest minds. Yet from this remote corner of northern Greece, Aristotle's journey into the foundations of science, philosophy, and reason had begun. Aristotle's early world was not dominated by poets or politicians, but by observation, discipline, and the study of nature. His father, Nicomachus, served as a physician to the Macedonian royal family. This was no ordinary profession in the ancient world. Medicine required careful attention to the human body, patterns of illness, causes and effects, habits of mind that would leave a deep and lasting imprint on Aristotle's thinking, long before he ever encountered formal philosophy. Growing up around medical practice meant that Aristotle was exposed early to the idea that the world could be understood through systematic study rather than myth alone. The human body was not mysterious by divine whim, but a structure that could be examined, categorized, and explained. This environment quietly trained him to ask why things happen, not just that they happen. A crucial distinction that would later define his entire intellectual legacy. The Macedonian court, through his father's service, also brought Aristotle into contact with power, organization, and hierarchy. He witnessed how knowledge was valued by rulers, how expertise could grant access to influence, and how reason could serve authority. These early impressions would later resurface when Aristotle turned his attention to politics, ethics, and the nature of the state. Tragedy struck early in Aristotle's life when he lost both parents at a young age. Orphaned, he was sent to live under the guardianship of a family associate. This sudden separation from home forced him into independence and reflection, sharpening his inner world. Rather than breaking him, this loss seems to have driven him deeper into study, observation, and self-discipline. By the time Aristotle left Stagira as a teenager, he was no longer simply the son of a court physician. He carried with him a unique intellectual foundation, one shaped by medicine, royal influence, and early loss. These formative years prepared him for the next decisive step of his life. His arrival in Athens, where his mind would collide with the greatest thinkers of the age and begin its transformation into one of history's most powerful engines of thought. At around 17 years old, Aristotle arrived in Athens, the intellectual heart of the Greek world. The city was alive with debate, rival schools of thought, and a restless search for truth. For a young mind eager to understand how the world worked, Athens was not merely a destination, it was an initiation into a far larger universe of ideas. At the centre of this world stood Plato and his famous institution, the Plato's Academy. Unlike a modern school, the Academy was an open environment where mathematics, metaphysics, ethics, and politics were explored through dialogue rather than rigid instruction. Aristotle entered as a student, but he quickly distinguished himself through his intensity, discipline, and relentless questioning. For nearly 20 years, Aristotle remained within the Academy's walls. He studied Plato's theory of forms, the nature of reality, and the pursuit of ideal knowledge. Yet even as he absorbed his teacher's ideas, Aristotle showed signs of intellectual independence. He was not content to accept concepts simply because they were elegant or authoritative. He wanted them tested against experience and logic. While Plato emphasized abstract ideals, Aristotle increasingly turned his attention toward the observable world. He asked how ideas applied to living beings, physical objects, and real political communities. This growing contrast did not create hostility, but it did shape a quiet divergence. Aristotle was learning how to disagree respectfully, refining his own method without openly rejecting his teacher. Within the academy, Aristotle also took on the role of a lecturer and researcher. He engaged in debates with other students, refined arguments, and began forming the analytical habits that would later define his work. These years were not passive education, but active intellectual training. Years spent sharpening tools rather than delivering final answers. When Plato died in 347 BCE, Aristotle left the academy, not as a disciple in search of a master, but as a thinker fully formed and ready to chart his own path. His time in Athens had given him depth, discipline, and philosophical rigor, but it had also clarified something essential. Understanding the world required more than ideas alone. It required careful observation, classification, and reason grounded in reality. Over time, Aristotle began to feel that philosophy had drifted too far from the tangible world. While he respected the intellectual power of his teacher, he questioned whether truth could exist entirely apart from physical reality. This growing unease marked the beginning of a decisive shift in his thinking. At the center of this divergence was Plato's belief that perfect, unchanging forms existed beyond the material world. Aristotle found this idea intellectually impressive but practically limiting. For him, separating ideal concepts from real objects raised a troubling question. How could knowledge be meaningful if it was disconnected from lived experience? Instead of searching for truth in a higher, invisible realm, Aristotle turned his attention to the world as it appeared to the senses. Plants, animals, human behavior, and political systems became legitimate subjects of philosophical inquiry. He believed that understanding began with careful observation, not abstract speculation. This shift did not represent a rejection of reason, but a redefinition of its foundation. Aristotle argued that general principles should emerge from studying many specific cases. Knowledge, in his view, was built step by step, from experience to pattern, from pattern to principle, rather than descending from ideal forms imposed on reality. His emphasis on empirical study led him to develop new methods of classification and analysis. Where Plato sought universal truths through dialogue and abstraction, Aristotle dissected, categorized, and compared. This approach laid the groundwork for future scientific thinking, centuries before the scientific method was formally defined. By moving philosophy closer to the natural world, Aristotle fundamentally changed its direction. His break with Plato was not a moment of rebellion, but a gradual realignment, one that shifted Western thought away from pure idealism and toward a tradition grounded in evidence, experience, and systematic inquiry. After the death of Aristotle, Athens no longer offered the intellectual or political stability it once had. Rather than remain in a city dominated by uncertainty and shifting loyalties, Aristotle chose movement over permanence. This decision marked the start of a restless and highly productive phase of his life, defined not by classrooms, but by landscapes, cities, and direct engagement with the world. He travelled extensively across Asia Minor and the islands of the Aegean, encountering diverse environments and cultures. Each region presented new political systems, natural conditions, and social structures. These journeys transformed Aristotle from a philosopher shaped by debate into one shaped by comparison. Difference itself became a source of insight. Away from formal institutions, Aristotle immersed himself in the study of living organisms. Coastal regions exposed him to marine life. while inland territories revealed variations in plants and animals unknown to mainland Greece. Rather than relying on second-hand accounts, he observed species directly, recording their structures, behaviours, and environments with remarkable precision. His travels also sharpened his understanding of human societies. Aristotle examined how cities were governed, how laws were enforced, and how power was distributed. By comparing constitutions and civic traditions, he began forming broader conclusions about politics. Not as an ideal system, but as a living process shaped by geography, culture, and circumstance. Natural science occupied an equally central role during these years. Weather patterns, landforms, and physical change became subjects of inquiry. Aristotle treated nature as something ordered and intelligible, governed by causes that could be identified through patient study rather than speculation. By the end of this period, Aristotle had quietly assembled an intellectual foundation unlike anything before it. His philosophy was no longer confined to argument or theory. It was grounded in observation across the natural and human worlds. These years of travel did not distract him from philosophy. They expanded it, preparing him for the final and most influential phase of his career. When Aristotle was summoned to Macedonia, it was not merely an academic appointment. It was a strategic decision with global consequences. The Macedonian court sought a mind capable of shaping a future ruler, someone who could instill discipline, curiosity, and moral judgment in a prince destined for power. Aristotle accepted the task knowing that ideas taught in youth could echo across history. His student was Alexander the Great, a boy of fierce ambition and restless intelligence. Aristotle did not teach him as a passive pupil. Lessons were crafted to challenge, provoke, and refine. Philosophy was presented not as abstract thought, but as a guide for action, how to rule, how to judge, and how to understand the human condition. Science formed a central pillar of this education. Aristotle introduced Alexander to the study of nature, geography, and causation, encouraging him to observe the world closely. This training fostered a ruler who would later ask questions about lands, peoples, animals, and climates wherever his armies travelled, turning conquest into a form of inquiry. Ethics and self-control were equally emphasized. Aristotle stressed moderation, responsibility, and the dangers of unchecked power. Kingship, he taught, was not simply dominance, but stewardship, an idea that sought to temper ambition with reason, even if reality would later test these lessons. Greek culture occupied a privileged place in Alexander's education. Literature, especially epic poetry, was used to shape ideals of heroism and honour. Through these stories, Alexander learned to see himself as part of a larger Hellenic tradition, a bearer of culture as well as a commander of armies. The relationship between teacher and student did not end with formal instruction. As Alexander rose to power, traces of Aristotle's influence appeared in his patronage of learning, his interest in knowledge, and his vision of a connected world. Though their paths eventually diverged, this period stands as one of the most extraordinary intersections of philosophy and power in human history. After years spent shaping minds beyond the walls of any single city, Aristotle returned to Athens with a clear purpose: to build an intellectual centre guided by his own methods. Athens remained a crossroads of ideas, but Aristotle was no longer a student or an outsider. He came back as a thinker ready to define the direction of philosophy on his own terms. Rather than joining existing institutions, Aristotle founded a new school known as the Lyceum. This was not simply a place of lectures, but a living workshop of inquiry. Knowledge here was meant to grow through discussion, investigation, and collaboration rather than passive listening. Teaching at the Lyceum followed an unusual rhythm. Aristotle often instructed his students while walking through covered colonnades and open courtyards. These moving discussions encourage active thinking, linking physical motion with mental exploration. From this practice emerged the name peripatetic school, meaning those who learn by walking. The subjects taught at the Lyceum were vast in scope. Logic, ethics, politics, biology, and natural philosophy were treated as interconnected fields rather than isolated disciplines. Aristotle believed that understanding reality required examining it from multiple angles, each reinforcing the other. Research played a central role in daily life at the Lyceum. Students collected data, observed nature, compared political systems, and organized knowledge systematically. This collaborative approach turned the school into something resembling an early research institute, decades ahead of its time. Through the Lyceum, Aristotle created more than a school. He established a model of learning that valued evidence, dialogue, and structure. Its influence extended far beyond Athens, shaping intellectual traditions that would endure for centuries and laying foundations for both philosophy and science as organized pursuits. For Aristotle, nature was not a backdrop to philosophy, but one of its central subjects. He believed that living things followed patterns that could be discovered through patient and repeated observation. This conviction drove him to examine the natural world with a level of detail rarely attempted in antiquity. Aristotle devoted extensive attention to animals, observing their anatomy, behavior, and modes of reproduction. He described differences between species with remarkable precision, noting distinctions in organs, movement, and life cycles. Rather than treating animals as symbolic creatures, he approached them as biological systems, governed by internal principles. Plants also formed an essential part of his investigations. Aristotle explored how plants grew, reproduced, and interacted with their environment. Though limited by the scientific tools of his time, he recognized fundamental difference between plant and animal life, especially in movement, sensation, and nutrition. One of his most enduring contributions was the attempt to classify living organisms systematically. Aristotle grouped species according to shared characteristics, creating ordered categories that reflected observable similarities. This method marked a crucial step away from myth-based explanations toward structured scientific reasoning. Beyond individual species, Aristotle studied natural processes such as growth, decay, and change. He sought to understand why things develop as they do, focusing on causes rather than surface appearances. This search for underlying explanations shaped his broader approach to science and philosophy alike. Through these studies, Aristotle established a foundation for biology as a field of inquiry. His emphasis on observation, classification, and causal explanation influenced natural science for centuries, earning him recognition as one of the earliest thinkers to treat life itself as something that could be studied systematically and rationally. For Aristotle, understanding how humans think was as important as understanding the natural world. He believed that clear reasoning was the foundation of all knowledge. Without a reliable method for thinking correctly, even the most detailed observations could lead to error. This conviction led Aristotle to develop a formal system of logic, centered on the syllogism. By structuring arguments into premises and conclusions, he showed how valid reasoning could be tested, step by step. This was not merely a philosophical exercise, it was a tool designed to separate sound arguments from persuasion, rhetoric, or assumption. In ethics, Aristotle shifted the focus away from rigid rules toward character and habit. In Nicomachean Ethics, he explored what it means to live a good life, arguing that virtue is developed through practice, rather than imposed by law. Happiness, in his view, was not pleasure alone, but a life lived in accordance with reason. Aristotle placed moderation at the centre of moral life. He described virtue as a balance between extremes, courage between recklessness and fear, generosity between excess and greed. Ethics, therefore, was not abstract morality, but practical guidance for everyday decision-making. His political thought extended these ideas into the structure of society. In politics, Aristotle examined different forms of government, comparing how they functioned in reality rather than in theory. He treated the state as a natural extension of human communities, shaped by culture, law, and shared purpose. By linking logic, ethics, and politics, Aristotle created an integrated vision of human life. Reason-guided thought, virtue-shaped character, and political organization reflected collective values. Together, these works influenced philosophers, theologians, and lawmakers for centuries, forming a backbone of Western intellectual tradition. The death of Alexander the Great triggered a wave of political tension across the Greek world, and Athens was no exception. Anti-Macedonian sentiments surged as the city sought to distance itself from years of foreign dominance. In this charged atmosphere, associations that once brought prestige now became sources of suspicion. Aristotle found himself increasingly vulnerable. His long-standing ties to Macedonia, once politically advantageous, now placed him in danger. Accusations of impiety, charges with a long and deadly history in Athens, began to circulate, echoing earlier persecutions of philosophers whose ideas unsettled public opinion. Rather than submit himself to a trial driven by politics, rather than justice, Aristotle made a deliberate choice to leave the city. This was not an act of fear, but of calculation. He understood the mood of Athens and recognized that reason carried little weight in moments of collective anger. According to tradition, Aristotle remarked that he would not allow Athens to sin twice against philosophy, a clear reference to the execution of Socrates decades earlier. The statement reflected both moral clarity and historical awareness. Aristotle saw himself not as fleeing guilt, but as preserving philosophy from another irreversible injustice. He withdrew to the city of Chalcis, distancing himself from the political storms of Athens. There, removed from public debate and institutional life, his final months were spent in relative quiet. The exile marked a sharp contrast to the influence and authority he once held, underscoring how fragile intellectual freedom could be in times of political upheaval. Aristotle's departure from Athens closed the final chapter of his public life. It served as a powerful reminder that even the greatest minds were not immune to the pressures of power and resentment. Yet by choosing exile over silence or submission, Aristotle preserved not only his life, but the integrity of a philosophical tradition that would outlive the politics of his age. In 322 BCE, Aristotle died in the city of Chalcis at the age of 62. Far from the intellectual centres where he had taught and debated, his final days passed quietly. There was no public ceremony, no grand farewell, only the closing of a life that had transformed how knowledge itself was understood. At the time of his death, Aristotle was not universally celebrated. His ideas were complex, demanding, and often misunderstood. Yet the absence of immediate recognition did not diminish their power. His writings, preserved and studied by later generations, carried within them a framework that could be applied to almost every field of inquiry. In the centuries that followed, Aristotle's works found new life in the Islamic world. Scholars translated, commented upon, and expanded his texts, integrating them into theology, medicine, astronomy, and logic. Through this tradition, Aristotle became known not merely as a philosopher, but as the first teacher, a foundational authority in rational thought. Medieval Europe later rediscovered Aristotle, largely through these Islamic scholars. His ideas reshaped universities, influenced Christian theology, and provided a structured approach to learning. Logic became a core discipline, ethics a guide to moral reasoning, and natural philosophy a bridge between faith and observation. Even as modern science moved beyond many of Aristotle's conclusions, his method endured. The emphasis on systematic inquiry, clear definitions, and careful reasoning remained central to education and research. He taught humanity not only what to think about the world, but how to think about it. More than 2,000 years after his death, Aristotle's legacy continues to shape classrooms, laboratories, and philosophical debate. Few individuals have left such a deep and lasting imprint on human thought. Though his life ended in quiet exile, his ideas achieved something far greater: intellectual immortality.